Welcome to our Revenge Taken channel. Let's start the story. I received a call that my husband Mike had been in a falling accident and rushed to the hospital. There, the doctor told me the surgery was successful, but Mike hadn't regained consciousness. He could wake up soon, or it might take a year or even 10. Hearing this, I collapsed to my knees in despair. The next day, my nephew Tyler visited the hospital room. I hadn't seen him in years. "Auntie, Uncle Mike left something with me to give to you a while back," he said, handing me a letter. He insisted I read it alone in private. I read the letter revealing an unbelievable confession from Mike. To verify his confession, I undressed the unconscious Mike and found confirmation of the letter's contents. Unbeknownst to me, Mike's secret was exposed, leading to an unexpected turn of events. Mike and I got married early among our friends because we clicked so well. It was around the time I started enjoying my work, so I told Mike I wanted to continue working after marriage, and we agreed to support each other. Years passed, and I think we're still a very close couple. Before turning 30, I wanted children, and when I shared this with Mike, he too expressed a desire to start a family. We then began actively trying to conceive. One day, Mike's voluntarily institutionalized father, whom we couldn't inconvenience, passed away. We had visited him regularly, and the last visit was just half a month ago. He seemed well then, so his death was sudden and shocking. The loss hit us hard to the point where we could barely eat. I received a lot of help from my father-in-law during his lifetime. My husband Mike and I married in our early 20s when he wasn't earning much. In the beginning, we were greatly aided by food supplies from my in-laws. Eventually, we started earning enough to raise a child and began thinking about repaying my father-in-law. Just as he decided to move into a facility, my mother-in-law had passed away 2 years earlier, and we wanted to repay our debt to my father-in-law since we couldn't do the same for her. So when my mother-in-law passed first, Mike and I offered to live with my father-in-law, but he didn't want to trouble us, a young couple, and chose to live in a facility managed with his savings. When he moved into the facility, he sold the family home and land. The funds from this sale were likely used for his stay at the facility. He once mentioned wanting to give a living inheritance to Mike, saying he had more money than he needed for his remaining years. Mike, not wanting to worry about it, told him to spend it freely and declined the inheritance. Who could have imagined that after my mother-in-law's death, my father-in-law would leave us so soon? Mike regretted not insisting on living together and not being able to repay his father's kindness, but we couldn't mourn forever. The nightmare from my mother-in-law's death was about to recur. Mike has an older sister who is somewhat problematic, and I've hardly met her. When my mother-in-law died, she was only concerned about the inheritance, ignoring my grieving father-in-law and us. Even before the funeral, she demanded her share of the inheritance in a commanding tone. Eventually, to silence his demanding daughter, my father-in-law gave her what he called severance money under the condition that she never show her face to him again. We took this as an effective disarmament. Since then, she hasn't appeared before my father-in-law. She wants to see him but can't as he hasn't shared his whereabouts. Mike and I had not been informed about the sale of his parents' house, so it seemed like his sister hadn't visited there either. Therefore, she likely didn't know that the house and land had already been sold. Knowing her, she might demand a share of the sale proceeds once she finds out. We could keep my father-in-law's death a secret, but dealing with her complaints later would be unpleasant. So we decided to contact her and distribute everything equally to avoid future troubles. The problem is the will. My father-in-law was very concerned about her actions after his death. He said he needed to leave a clear will to prevent her from acting rashly. He planned to meet with a lawyer, which I heard about half a month ago during our last meeting, but he passed away before that could happen. Mike had to talk to her, so he called her mobile, not sure if she'd answer. After a long ring, she picked up. Mike skipped the greetings and went straight to the point, telling her about my father-in-law's death, the funeral arrangements, and then the inheritance. But as time passed, Mike became increasingly irritated. Mike's sister has a loud voice, and I could hear her through the phone. She said she couldn't attend the funeral, but demanded her share of the inheritance. There was no word of mourning for my father-in-law. Despite his frustration, Mike tried to remain calm while talking to her, but it seemed like she overpowered the conversation. After hanging up, Mike was visibly upset and shared that she had apparently divorced and that we would discuss the inheritance distribution after the funeral. Mike was particularly concerned about his nephew, her son. She mentioned her divorce, but there was no talk of how or where her son was doing. Every attempt to bring him up was overshadowed by the inheritance issue. Mike thought it's better she didn't come to the funeral to avoid a repeat of what happened at my mother-in-law's funeral. I agreed to stay silent if that's what he preferred. We were so busy with the aftermath of the funeral and other procedures. During this time, she kept calling almost daily about the inheritance. Initially, Mike explained patiently, but gradually he began to ignore her calls, just responding nonchalantly. Fed up with her constant calls, Mike decided to meet her, and she suddenly became very cheerful about the progression of things. Hearing this, I felt uneasy and wanted to accompany him, but he insisted on meeting her alone. For the past 2 years, I've been helping with all the procedures and arrangements following the deaths of Mike's parents. He felt it wouldn't be right to involve me further in dealing with his sister and the inheritance distribution. He assured me he'd handle it well and asked me not to worry. So, trusting his words, I decided to wait and see how things would unfold. I had initially planned to join him regardless, but a sudden surge in work at my company made it impossible for me to match his schedule. So, Mike ended up going to meet her alone as planned. That day was incredibly busy at work, with everyone silently focusing on their tasks. During my break, I couldn't help but worry about Mike. I tried to switch back to work mode, believing no news meant things were going smoothly. Then suddenly my phone rang. It was an unknown number, but the hospital's name appeared on the screen. Modern phones display the sender's name even if the number isn't saved, especially if it's from an important institution. Mike and I are both proud of our health, with hardly any hospital visits in our history. The hospital called was the one my mother-in-law had frequented years before her death, but I couldn't imagine why they'd contact me. I hesitated before answering the call, but eventually I picked up. The nurse introduced herself and confirmed the hospital's name. After hearing Mike's name, she asked if I was his wife, and upon confirming, I was told that Mike had been urgently brought to the hospital. They needed me to come quickly. So I explained the situation to my boss and left work early. Upon arriving, Mike was still undergoing treatment. A nurse hurriedly explained his condition, saying he needed emergency surgery. I was asked to consent and sign various documents, which left me feeling overwhelmed and blank. Seeing me in such a state, the nurse sternly yet kindly said, "You need to pull yourself together. Your husband is fighting to live." Her words woke me up. Mike was fighting, and the doctors were working hard to save him. I slapped my cheek slightly to regain composure and followed the nurse's instructions, signing the necessary documents. With the doctor's efforts, they said there was a high chance Mike would regain consciousness, which brought a slight relief. Though I remained vigilant as I arranged the essentials for his hospital stay and contacted various people, it wasn't until late at night that I could finally sit beside him, feeling the warmth of his hand. I was overwhelmed with relief that he was alive. Tears naturally flowed, but since it was just us in the room, I let them be, holding his hand tightly. I kept talking to him, hoping for his consciousness to return, but he remained unresponsive throughout the night. A nurse suggested I take a rest, but I refused to leave his side, taking pride in my physical resilience. Around noon, Mike's sister unexpectedly appeared in the room. This was the first time I'd seen her since my mother-in-law's funeral. We exchanged a brief nod, but internally I wondered why she was here. I had informed a few relatives and work colleagues about Mike's situation, but she wasn't among them. Considering the issues at my mother-in-law's funeral, I knew no other relatives were in touch with her either. In essence, she was practically ostracized by the family and our father-in-law. Why was she here? Pondering alone was a waste of time. I asked her how she knew about this hospital. It's common to hear stories about someone spotting a known person at a hospital, but I hadn't stepped out of Mike's room. It was impossible for her to have seen me anywhere else in the hospital. Does it even matter what's going on with him? Is he brain dead? Does it look like he'll make it, huh? Her assumption of brain death based on his unconscious state seemed insensitive. Wouldn't a normal reaction be to inquire about his safety or chances of recovery? She seemed to have already written off any hope of his recovery. So he hasn't regained consciousness. Guess he doesn't have long then. Since I made the effort to come here, you should at least cover my travel and meal expenses. Her attitude was infuriating. I had not invited her, and yet she had the audacity to demand compensation for her unasked visit. Struggling to keep my irritation from showing, I reminded myself that we were in a hospital surrounded by other patients and close to the nurse's station. The last thing I wanted was to cause a scene in front of Mike. I took out a bit more money than necessary from my wallet and handed it to her, anticipating her potential dissatisfaction with a lesser amount. I didn't want any further conversation with her at this moment. Seemingly satisfied with the amount, she left the room with a light step, mentioning she was going to eat. But just as she left, she stopped and called the child into the room. "You know who this is, right? My son, your nephew. I'm going to eat, so look after him for me," she commanded in an imposing tone and quickly walked away from the hospital room, her heels clicking sharply on the floor. She moved so swiftly that I didn't even have a chance to say anything to her. The boy left behind seemed hesitant at first, but then approached me with a determined look. "Hi, I have something Uncle asked me to give you." It appeared he was referring to Mike. He gestured that he wanted to speak privately, so I crouched to his level. He took something out of his pocket and handed it to me. "Uncle said to give this to you without Mom knowing," he said. "If I do well, I might be able to live with Dad. I did it right, didn't I?" I patted his head a few times, reassuring him that he had done well. The item he handed me was a letter from Mike. It wasn't a formal letter, but rather a piece of paper torn from a notebook. I hurriedly read the letter. Mike and his sister were initially supposed to meet at a cafe. However, on the day of their meeting, she suddenly called him to her house instead. Mike wrote that he suspected something was amiss and decided to document the events while watching for an opportunity. He mentioned a mysterious injury he had sustained around the time of his mother's death, which was news to me. He probably treated it himself without my knowledge. The letter made me wonder why he was bringing this up now. As I continued reading, an unbelievable story unfolded. During the disputes over his mother's inheritance, Mike once felt an odd sensation in his leg after walking through a crowd. He discovered a deep cut on his thigh, shocked. He found a utility knife in his pocket that he used for work. The blade wasn't exposed, but he figured it might have accidentally cut him. Fortunately, the wound seemed minor and likely to heal quickly, so during that busy time he chose not to tell me and took care of the injury himself. However, now his sister was implying that she was responsible for the injury. She claimed to have inflicted it in the crowd, aiming for an artery but failing. She even knew the exact location of the wound. I checked Mike's thigh while he was unconscious and found the old cut. It wasn't that I didn't believe him, but part of me hoped such a wound wouldn't exist. The thought of someone harming another for inheritance was appalling. While receiving an inheritance is certainly better than not, causing harm to increase one's share is reprehensible. However, contrary to my wishes, I found an old cut on Mike's thigh, clear evidence of his sister's malicious intent. As I felt anger bubbling up, I carefully redressed Mike and turned my attention back to the letter. Mike wrote that he was convinced his life was in danger. The hurried writing indicated he had written it while his sister briefly left the room. Oddly, she had insisted on having her son, Mike's nephew, present during their inheritance discussion. Before she was disowned, Mike had adored his nephew, and she probably remembered this. It seemed like she planned to use her nephew as bait in a tearful plea to secure a larger share of the inheritance. Mike, feeling threatened, had instructed his nephew to give me the letter if anything happened to him. He added in the letter that there was evidence in the inner pocket of his jacket. I searched the jacket he was wearing at the time of his accident. The bloodstains from the fall indicated the severity of the accident. I hadn't touched it since the nurse gave it to me, along with his other personal belongings. As instructed, I reached into the inner pocket and found a hard object. It was a voice recorder. I recalled the doctor mentioning that people usually try to protect their head during a fall, but Mike had injuries on his arms that suggested he was shielding his chest. The doctor had even asked if Mike had any heart conditions, which was surprising, since Mike always boasted about his health and had never suffered from any serious illnesses. The voice recorder from the chest pocket explained it all. Mike had shielded it to protect the evidence at the risk of his own life. I played the evidence. Mike had risked his life to protect and was left speechless. The contents were so shocking that I couldn't find the words to express my astonishment, but it was undoubtedly evidence that could incriminate his sister. I immediately contacted the police. Shortly afterward, Mike's sister returned, cheerfully patting her stomach and saying she was satisfied, demanding the chair I was using. She sat down, crossing her legs, and started touching up her makeup. I asked her about the outcome of the inheritance distribution. She claimed that Mike had agreed to give her a larger share. When I asked if she was with Mike when he fell, she said they had parted ways right after leaving the cafe where they met and claimed she knew nothing about the accident. She was lying. The discussion had been abruptly changed to take place at the sister-in-law's house, and all the subsequent events were captured on the voice recorder Mike had protected. I decided not to confront her lies immediately, but instead asked other questions about memories with Mike and their father. Why she hadn't told us about her divorce earlier and how she was living now. I also inquired about when she left the restaurant, how long she stayed there, and the name of the place. However, she soon became irritated and pushed me away, exclaiming, "He was my father. You're just an outsider who married into the family." Indeed, I might not have a direct connection to the inheritance, but Mike's life-threatening accident certainly involved me. So I pleaded with her to tell the truth. "Do you think I'm lying?" she retorted, visibly outraged. I played the voice recorder Mike had risked his life to save. The recording began with Mike expressing concerns about the difficulty of their conversation and his intention to record it for evidence. His sister immediately pressured him for a larger share of their father's inheritance. Initially, she was somewhat reserved, claiming she needed help raising her nephew alone. But when Mike rejected her suggestion, demanding that she ask her ex-husband for child support, her demeanor shifted dramatically. She confessed to having inflicted the cut on Mike's thigh during the dispute over their mother's inheritance. "I thought if you were out of the picture, I'd get more," she said gleefully. Though she admitted to being scared back then, limiting her actions to a mere cut, she now boasted about being capable of making it look like an accident. "Be careful of your back and high places. I'm always watching for a chance," she threatened. The fear and tension in Mike's voice were palpable through the recording. Feeling the danger of staying at her house, he cleverly changed the topic and suggested moving to a public place. "There's a great fish restaurant nearby. Let me treat you, sister. Why don't you get ready?" Suddenly, her demeanor shifted, and she left to get ready. In that moment, Mike quickly wrote a letter to me, entrusting it to his nephew. In a hushed voice, he mentioned the voice recorder, hoping I would find it. But just in case, he gave the letter to his nephew. After leaving her house for a restaurant, Mike treated his sister to lunch, but she remained her usual self. Upon leaving the restaurant, Mike suggested consulting a lawyer due to the deadlock in their discussion. When Mike said he was heading home, His sister insisted on accompanying him to the station. During their walk, she tried to dissuade him from involving a lawyer, claiming it would complicate matters. When Mike refused, she began shouting at him in the street. Remaining calm, Mike insisted that involving a third party was best and said he would speak to a lawyer he knew. Suddenly, there was a sound like something falling or rolling, followed by commotion and voices calling for an ambulance. The recording stopped, possibly because the stop button was hit when Mike's jacket was removed for emergency treatment. After the playback ended, the sister-in-law initially seemed shocked, but then became defiant. "So what? How does this prove anything? It's just a sibling argument. It's not about the inheritance dispute," she claimed. "It's about proving that Mike's fall was not an accident, but an incident." "Really? That doesn't prove anything. Are you trying to say I'm the culprit? There's no evidence that I did anything." "This is enough evidence to show the police that there's a possibility of foul play," I interjected. While the sister-in-law was away, the police had already arrived and confirmed the contents of the voice recorder. They had been waiting in hiding, anticipating her return. "Police here," she gasped in disbelief. She had always looked down on others and seemed to have a misguided confidence that she could never be caught or held accountable by the police. As the reality of her actions began to dawn on her, her previously arrogant and confident demeanor shifted to one of fear. The entrance to the hospital room was covertly blocked by plainclothes detectives posing as visitors. We were on the 4th floor, leaving no easy escape route, even if she wanted to flee. The police jumping out of a window would not end well for her. A detective entered the room, approaching the sister-in-law, who was frantically looking around with a pale face, desperately searching for an escape route. They wanted to question her since she might have been the last person with Mike, suggesting the incident was more than an accident. Maybe it was just someone who looked like me. "There are supposedly 3 people in the world who look like each of us," she blurted out, seemingly trying to claim a case of mistaken identity. Despite her voice being recorded on the voice recorder, she tried to use a childish excuse to escape responsibility. I couldn't help but let out a wry smile at her attempt. The police were not swayed by her excuses, dismissing them with a nonchalant, yeah, I get it. Culprits often change their stories and make incoherent statements, which was exactly what the sister-in-law was doing. As the police took her away, I handed over the voice recorder to the detective in charge, who seemed to be the lead investigator. After the sister-in-law's drama subsided, another person appeared. I had made another call when contacting the police. As the nephew saw the man enter, he exclaimed, "Daddy," and leaped into his father's arms. The former brother-in-law acknowledged me with a nod and then embraced his son, seemingly vowing never to let go. During the interaction between the sister-in-law and the police, the nephew had been scared and hiding behind me. He had been disheartened even after the police left, but his spirits lifted instantly upon seeing his father. This was the first time I had met the former brother-in-law since my mother-in-law's funeral. I had contacted him for a reason. The voice recorder Mike had safeguarded contained the sister-in-law's true feelings about her son. She had bluntly stated that she never wanted a child and only gave birth because she had to, never feeling any affection for him. Childcare was mostly left to the former brother-in-law, and his parents had often helped. So when they divorced, he thought he would easily get custody. However, desiring child support, the sister-in-law managed to convincingly portray herself as a devoted mother and won custody. It seems that mothers often have an advantage in custody battles. The former brother-in-law had to accept this, thinking maybe she had developed maternal feelings as she had never mistreated their son. It's often said that women have a maternal instinct, but in the case of the sister-in-law, that theory was an exception. In reality, she only took custody for child support and squandered the money on herself. Her cruel behavior towards her son, such as depriving him of food and locking him in a closet, was apparently routine. Mike's letter revealed his desire to rescue his nephew from this situation, even if it meant giving up his entire inheritance. Mike's insistence on involving a lawyer was not only about the inheritance, but also about his nephew's welfare. I couldn't help but feel that behind my husband's unwavering determination, even in the face of the danger posed by his sister, there was a resolve to save our nephew. It made me realize that I too needed to uphold that determination. I never relied on the inheritance. While having it is better than not, we are young and can earn our own way. I wouldn't blame Mike for giving up his inheritance, especially if it was for his nephew's sake. Mike believed that by offering the entire inheritance, the sister-in-law, driven by greed, would relinquish custody of her nephew. The letter also mentioned that once the nephew was safely away from his mother, he would be entrusted to his father. However, given the harm done to Mike, simply transferring the inheritance and retrieving the nephew wouldn't be the end of it. I felt the sister-in-law needed to be held accountable and made to regret her actions. The former brother-in-law became increasingly enraged as I relayed everything from Mike's letter. Seeing his drastically changed son, he blamed himself for what had happened after the divorce. The nephew lived with his mother, but the former brother-in-law had managed to secure a monthly visitation agreement. However, while the sister-in-law consistently demanded child support, she never allowed the former brother-in-law a single visitation. She continuously made excuses to refuse him access to their son. She threatened that if he persisted, he would never see his nephew again, leaving him powerless. Expressing regret for not confronting my sister-in-law sooner or secretly checking on her, her ex-husband apologized repeatedly to his nephew. He then resolved to confront his sister anew. It turns out she had already been reported, not only for the suspicious circumstances surrounding Mike's fall, but also for her mistreatment of the children. Youth Division arrived, expressing a desire to hear from the nephew. You as a guardian was required. My ex-brother-in-law accompanied him, and I was asked to join as well. Mike's recovery is uncertain. He might regain consciousness in an hour or even a year. Given the urgency of the nephew's situation, prioritizing him seemed the right choice. At the police station, a confrontation occurred between my ex-brother-in-law, who was accompanying his nephew, and Mike's sister, still just a person of interest at that point. In a moment of distress, or perhaps stupidity, she began to make outrageous accusations. It was him. This man told me to do it. He's a demon. I'm the real victim here, seduced by a demon into marriage. She hysterically labeled her son as a child of a demon. Her ex-husband couldn't stay silent. What do you mean, child of a demon? Stop harming the kid further after pushing Mike down and continuing your excuses. Blaming others makes you the real demon. Despite his brother's logical argument, she wouldn't stop threatening. I'll make you suffer the same fate. Everyone at the police station looked disdainfully as she was dragged away by the police. Given the risk she might harm others, she was detained. The investigation quickly advanced when surveillance footage from a shop near the staircase at the station entrance, where Mike was pushed, showed her making a pushing motion. Although the camera angle didn't confirm the push, the detective assured they would get a definitive confession. With the sister-in-law in custody, the focus shifted to the nephew's custody. Based on her recorded statements and the nephew's account, it was decided he should stay with my ex-brother-in-law. The nephew was overjoyed to live with his dad, who, along with his parents, was ensuring a comfortable life for him. After the police interrogation, I returned to the hospital resolved to stay by Mike's side until he regained consciousness. But the next morning Mike regained consciousness. Though there was no concrete proof yet, when told Mike's sister was being questioned by the police, he said he had something to tell the detective. Following Mike's request, we got the detective to come over. Mike told the detective that he was pushed from behind by his sister and said that her fingerprints, or rather her handprints, must be clearly on the jacket he was wearing at the time. The forensics confirmed her handprints on the jacket, along with clear fingerprints. However, fearing she might still find a way to deny it, the police went to great lengths to check all the nearby security cameras. Additionally, they appealed to the public for information. Someone who was filming nearby contacted them, saying their footage might have captured the altercation. The person checked their footage after realizing an incident had occurred and found it clearly showed the sister-in-law pushing Mike. Confronted with undeniable evidence, the sister-in-law was defeated and arrested without resistance. After some recovery, Mike, through his lawyer, demanded compensation and medical expenses from her. But her bank account was empty, and she owned nothing of significant value. Even her beloved brand bags were all fake, bought from dubious sources. When asked for compensation, she simply said she had nothing to give. Mike then proposed splitting his father's inheritance equally and later managed to collect the compensation and medical expenses when the inheritance was distributed. Although most of the inheritance went towards Mike's payments, a small amount did end up with the sister-in-law. However, all the money was used for legal fees for the crimes she committed, and now it seems there is hardly any money left in her account. This was because the sister-in-law, being selfish and not very bright, would end her contract with any lawyer who said something inconvenient for her, even if they were in the middle of an investigation. Since retainer fees are non-refundable, her money kept dwindling as she repeatedly fired lawyers. Eventually, the lawyer she chose, who just followed her orders, apparently couldn't provide a proper defense, making the trial look bleak. After being placed with my ex-brother-in-law, the nephew's emaciated body recovered to a size more fitting for his age. These circumstances heavily influenced the custody battle, and a lawyer skilled in custody issues successfully took the nephew away from the sister-in-law. They argued that proper upbringing was impossible under the sister-in-law due to her parenting style and the severity of her crimes, emphasizing how much my ex-brother-in-law loved the child. They showed that the nephew wanted to live with him and took into account the care he received after Mike's sister's arrest, smoothly securing custody. Now I hear they are living peacefully with my ex-father-in-law and his parents. Sometime after Mike was discharged and returned to normal life, I started feeling unwell. Worried it might be due to the strain of looking after him, I went for a checkup and found out we were expecting a new life. We talked about using what his sister did as a lesson, hoping to raise our child to always smile and be kind to others. We believe our happiness